There was no peace deal that was actually signed. The ceasefire seems like a goodwill gesture. The Taliban seem to be asking for autonomy, but their most strongest demand right now is 3 days you have for the Pakistani government, take out the Khasadar forces and the frontier forces to shed some light and to make us better understand the situation. We have with us our in-house analyst, Zarar Khoro. Zarar, now with this sort of a situation coming forward, the ceasefire seems to be a goodwill gesture. I really liked a little talk that we were having earlier on, that earlier Baitullah Masood had said, well, there's a ceasefire, if anybody does anything wrong, public punishments. Then we've got attacks. So what's going on? And their demands are like just going through the roof.
Well, the sticking point, at least the official statement coming from the Taliban, says that the negotiations broke down because the government did not in fact withdraw the FC and the Khasadar forces. But in my opinion, that was an untenable demand on the Taliban's part to begin with, because as we all know, the government really has no writ in the tribal areas. The security forces are the only symbol of the existence of the Pakistani state in those areas. So to withdraw those was effectively to cede absolute control of FATA to the militants. Secondly, every time, and there's been a lot of times, Ovais, you know, where there's been buzz in Western capitals of crossing the border and pacifying the tribal areas, the Pakistani argument has always been that you don't need to do that because our forces are capable of doing the job. Now, if there were no Pakistani forces in the tribal areas, then that argument no longer holds any water.
And that's a very sort of hot water situation for Pakistan in terms of the international governments and their international friends. That again, I'm going to use the same word, the Taliban seem to be asking for autonomy. They're like, please take the Khasadar forces out, the frontier forces out, we will man the checkpoints. Now, after moving to that second point that I'd also mentioned earlier on, Baitullah Masood, Supreme Commander, yes or no?
Well, I think we make the mistake of viewing the Taliban and in fact our own incarnation of the Taliban as a monolithic movement. I do not think that that's true. Now, if we come to the question of why the ceasefire was called off, there's two ways of looking at it. One is that it's simply a negotiating tactic. In any negotiations, you sometimes have to up the ante. And I believe that this might be what Baitullah Masood and his cohorts are trying to do. The second answer, and this is interesting, Ovais, and it ties in with your point, is that I believe that there are factions within factions at work here. Now, as we all know, just days after the peace agreement was first made public by Baitullah Masood's spokesman himself, there was a bomb blast in Mardan. Now, that is the chief minister of the NWFP. That is his hometown. So that is a clear message. Now, Baitullah tried to explain that away by saying that perhaps some militants weren't aware of the peace agreement, but I don't believe that that argument is really believable. Secondly, also, I'm sorry, but in Tank, we had firing, so there were 5 people killed there. So that is a signal that perhaps not all militant groups are under Baitullah Masood's control. Now, the perception is that he is the supreme commander of all militants, and I think that no one is more willing to perpetuate that perception than Baitullah Masood himself. So it might well be a face-saving gesture to call off the ceasefire.
Zarar, what's the government policy likely to be?
Well, the government policy, it's an unenviable position for the government, Peshutan, but I think we have already seen the contours of the government policy coming into play, and it is going to be essentially reverting to the same old policy that people have always used in the FATA, and that is to divide. Now, for example, we saw in Khyber Agency, we saw a conflict between Kuki Khel tribesmen and Mangalbagh militants leader, the militant cleric Mangalbagh. Now, that is evidence of an exploitable rift, which I'm sure that the government will be planning to exploit. They will try to exploit tensions between tribes and militants who threaten the very age-old tribal system with their increase in power. Secondly, we will probably see attempts to exploit differences between the Masoods and the Wazirs in Waziristan, because the Waziristan is not named Waziristan simply out of linguistic coincidence. It is named Waziristan because that has traditionally been the stronghold of the Wazirs. And the rise of Baitullah Masood threatens that age-old tribal balance in the region. So I think we will see the government supporting one tribal faction against another, perhaps even supporting one militant group against another. And that is in tune really with what people have been saying, what Rahman Malik was saying, what several US officials have been saying, that you negotiate with those who are willing to lay down their arms and you isolate those who are not, whom you then go after with extreme force.
Now we've got the government policy, the most possible government policy that we're going to see coming forward. We've got the fact that Baitullah Masood is a threat for the people of Waziristan. the age-old sort of rulers of Waziristan. But then one thing also comes forward. If Baitullah Masood is not the supreme commander of all the Taliban in Pakistan, why don't they come forward? Because we've seen them making public announcements. We did kill them. We did not kill this person. Why not? Of course, then maybe it's going to be easier for the government to decide who to go after and who not.
Well, this is true. But you see, it may not be politically feasible for the smaller splinter groups to openly oppose Baitullah's leadership, because that would put them in a position where their followers may well have to pick and choose. And Singhs and splinter groups by definition are smaller. Baitullah Masood certainly commands the largest organization of militants. But I think that we are going to see further splintering, and that has its pros and its cons. The more splinter groups, the more smaller groups there are, the greater increase of uncontrolled elements carrying out terror attacks across Pakistan. But it also does weaken the coherence of the overall militant movement.
Sarah, thank you very much for your time today. And for our viewers, well, we hope we've asked the right questions that even you wanted to ask. And we're not trying to reach some sort of a conclusion here, but just giving you the information so that you can decide for yourself what exactly the future holds for all of us.